There's so many people who've been named as suspects in the case of Jack the Ripper, and we still don't really have any answers. There were 300 people that were investigated, 80 people were detained, butchers especially. The authorities at the time came down hard on them, but we still don't have—
Bad time to be a butcher.
Bad time to be a butcher, or a slaughterer, which I also saw was apparently an occupation, a slaughterer.
So like a butcher, but more violent.
Right, just a worse butcher. But we still don't really— We still don't know the identity of Jack the Ripper. Now, what I am fully prepared to throw out is the conspiracy that it has something to do with the royal family, because if you believe that there were more than 5 victims, which I think, even if you just believe there were 6 and you include Martha Tabram in that, it can't be the royal family. So even though that is a really juicy theory, and go watch a documentary about it somewhere else, we have to throw that aside. So now I want to turn over to Mick, who is going to name his suspect, and then we're going to talk about some of ours.
In the time since the murders took place, and certainly in more recent years, an awful lot of suspects have been put forward as potential candidates for being the killer. Some of them are sensible, most of them are fairly ridiculous, and the majority of them we can certainly discount as possible candidates for actually being the killer. The first one we can forget about is the royal family. Nobody in the royal family had anything to do with it. Nobody thought that at the time, and no sensible researcher thinks that now. Sometimes people like to mention Aaron Kosminski as a candidate. He keeps coming up in a number of books. He was a mentally ill man who lived in the area. He spoke very poor or no English. Nobody seems entirely sure of where he was living, but he was actually locked up in a mental asylum before the end of the murders anyway, so there's no way it could possibly have been him. A man called James Maybrick is the supposed author of the Jack the Ripper diary, in which case he supposedly confesses to the crimes and how he did it and this kind of thing. He was actually dead before the end of the murders as well. There's no way it could have possibly been him, and the diary is being shown repeatedly to almost certainly be a hoax. My suspect that I'm putting forward, who I'm convinced personally has to be the killer, is a man named Albert Backett. Now, Albert Backett was a very strange man indeed, and it seems very odd to me that nobody really seems to have taken much of an interest in him beforehand. But Albert Backett was actually born and raised in the Whitechapel area. Growing up in the area, he was very familiar with all of the back streets and the alleyways and all the escape routes he would have needed. At the time of the murders, he was living by himself in a room on the first floor of number 13 Newnham Street, which is in the Goodman Fields area of Whitechapel, right in the middle of where all the murders took place. He was also 27 years old when the first murder took place. He was 30 years old after the murder of Frances Coles, which is an age that fits in with eyewitness accounts and the sensible, more reliable accounts of people who saw the killer. It also makes him around about the same sort of age that a modern investigating team would expect this type of killer to be today. He also fits the profile of a serial killer in many other ways. He had a number of criminal convictions for things you'd expect a killer to have today. He had a number of convictions for drunkenness, for violence, for stealing. He was repeatedly shown to be a liar on a number of occasions. He constantly injected himself into the investigation when there didn't really seem to be any need for it. He was constantly contacting newspapers, contacting the police. He claimed that Jack the Ripper was sending him letters to his house to warn him of murders and send him threats. He reckoned he'd met the killer on a couple of occasions and actually spoken to him. But like I said, he was shown to be a liar on almost all of these claims that he made. He also turned up unannounced to the inquest of Frances Coles and demanded to be on the jury just as they were about to be taken to view the body in the mortuary. When he was refused access to the jury and refused to be allowed to go to the mortuary, he then caused a big scene in the courtroom to such a degree that the coroner threatened to throw him out if he didn't sit down and behave himself. In my opinion, he just wanted to get a thrill out of seeing his victim sitting in the mortuary. Something else that's interesting is he actually worked as a copper plate engraver, engraving copper plates for banknote printing. This means that he would have had all the tools and the expertise to manipulate those coins that were found at the crime scene. And in 1889, he was actually arrested for passing counterfeit coins on 2 separate occasions. He then went to prison for stealing after the murder of Frances Coles. When he came out of prison again, he complained that he'd been wrongly convicted. He said he was going to leave, he was going to go to America, and after that he seems to pretty much disappear from history. At the point where Albert Backett disappears from all the records, the killer also disappears from the records. In my opinion, if this case was happening now, Albert Backett is far and away the #1 person that the investigators would want to go and speak to.
It's a really compelling theory.
That's really cool. I've actually never heard that theory.
Well, that's what's also kind of crazy and awesome about Mick's book is that if you just go on Wikipedia right now, which is where most people sort of start your beginning research into any case that you might have been interested in. Oh, I wanted to learn what happened with Ted Bundy, what happened with Jeffrey Dahmer, Jack the Ripper. You go through this exorbitant list of suspects, and Albert Backett is not named, and it seems like everyone else is named on just the Wikipedia page of suspects. So it is strange to me that Mick is naming a suspect that seems to fit so much and yet has sort of flown under the radar. What's especially strange is that at the time, Albert Backert was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, which was in part began because shit was going down in Whitechapel and they needed people to be more vigilant, so they started a committee to do that. And this is a guy,
neighborhood watch of Whitechapel.
Right. And a huge part of Mick's theory that I think it's important to stress is that Francis Cole's murder on February 13th, 1891 was attributed to Jack the Ripper. So remember, there are the 5 victims that everyone can agree with. I think you have to throw in Martha Tabram 6. And then even if you're hesitant to name Alice Mackenzie as another victim of Jack the Ripper, Francis Cole thrown in there towards the tail end as the final murder of Jack the Ripper is intrinsic to Mick's theory being true because of how much at that point in time Albert Backert inserted himself into the case. But this was something that he'd been doing for a while. Someone can be a liar, someone can be violent, someone can be a drunk. It doesn't make them Jack the Ripper. Where my red flags go off with regards to Albert Backert is how he really went out of his way to interact with authorities who were investigating the crimes of Jack the Ripper.
It makes absolute sense,
right,
that he would want a front row seat to see what he'd done, especially if he had to commit all these murders so quickly. And you know, except for Mary Kelly, he committed these murders, mutilated these women, and then split. So it makes sense that he would want to track the tail end of it and see how everyone else was reacting to it to get as much out of it as possible.
And we're also talking about a guy who knew the back alleys and these escape routes, if you will, very well. And you have to believe in a killer that must have known Whitechapel like the back of his hand, because otherwise the time period, and that's something I think that Mick does really well in his book, and we're gonna include a link below for you guys to check it out if you're interested, is the time frame in which these murders were committed. This sense of foreboding that you get where, you know, when Elizabeth Stride is killed and you know that within an hour, Catherine Eddowes is gonna be murdered, and just you don't do that in a city or a part of a city that you're unfamiliar with. You wouldn't be able to do that.
Right.
And all of this took place within walking distance of where Backert was reported to be living at the time. So that all jives for me. Now, a name that you probably are familiar with this case that's very sinister sounding but ultimately innocuous is Leather Apron. Did you come across this in your research?
I did. It was one of the early names that was being thrown around as, you know, this was also committed by.
Yeah. So Leather Apron,
the through link.
Yeah, Leather Apron was the guy that was named. His name is John Pizer. He came under suspicion. He was named after the first murder. People thought that this Leather Apron character, who was apparently treating prostitutes very badly, and the prostitute community was a very tight-knit web, and they were communicating with each other. Watch out for Leather Apron, this guy, and he had this pretty sinister, grim description. But ultimately, he had a rock-solid alibi, so he was thrown out. But it's interesting that even though he was totally innocent, because Leather Apron is so scary, it sounds very Leatherface, it's still a name that comes up in your research, even though the poor guy was in it. I mean, well, actually probably a shitty guy, but because he was not treating prostitutes well.
But of this particular crime.
Totally innocent. Another thing that I think I should bring up is the Mcnaughton Memoranda, which was put out by Assistant Chief Constable Melvin Mcnaughton. It was released in 1959. It was written in 1890, and he names 3 suspects. He names M.J. Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, who we saw referenced before, and Michael Ostrog. Now, all of these guys, I don't think are the killer, and but they are interesting. Like Kosminski, we said before, Mick was mentioning he's a Polish Jew. He's a resident of Whitechapel. He was insane. A lot of these men had violent histories. One Michael Ostrog was a Russian doctor and a convict, so that sort of jived with the rumors that were going around at the time. But ultimately, the only suspect, and I know I'm very biased because I believe so much in Mick's research that he's done and the exorbitant citing of sources that he had. has in the back is insane. I actually asked him when I took the tour, I was like, do you cite your sources? And he was like, yeah. And I feel so stupid for asking him that because they're so cited. Anyway, I think you have to throw out the Mcnaughton Memoranda because this guy came onto the investigation about a year after the last, after the murder took place. So he was reporting what he had heard around the police force, but it wasn't a firsthand account. And you have to base your assertions on firsthand accounts.
And as we've established earlier, repeated things start to sound like the truth. So a year later, if he was just hearing rumors, then
from people that were around on the case at the time.
Right.
But maybe people that weren't on the scene.
It's probably just a giant game of telephone.
Yeah.
You know, someone says something that's true and then it gets twisted a little bit and twisted a little bit. And then by the time it reaches him, he's like, yeah, I mean, I've heard this from many sources, but it wasn't necessarily
any credible source.
Right.
Or maybe it began as such and then it just got totally warped.
Right.
And I think that that's what you kind of come against when you talk about Jack the Ripper. It feels like I've been so frustrated in the weeks leading up to this episode because it feels like this endless rabbit hole, and you feel like you crack something and then you realize that actually it can't really be corroborated, or the DNA hasn't been peer reviewed, and you just feel like you're back at the beginning. And I can only imagine how it must have felt at the time when you have this guy running through the streets of Whitechapel and police are literally on his heels and they can't catch him. But I want to hear from
must have been
you, Jen.
Yes, Grace.
Why do you think the case of Jack the Ripper has captured the pop culture consciousness in the way that it obviously still has?
I think it's because we have no proof. We have no evidence. We have these gruesome murders, which, human nature, you can't help but be fascinated by. And there's no way of telling who did it. And so to have such a horrific set of circumstances and not have a name or a face or really anything concrete to say about it, it can just live in your mind as this giant question mark. And it gives your imagination room to grow and room to run with it. So I think it sticks around in pop culture because it is so adaptable, because we don't have a photograph of him. We don't have court records of when he was, put on trial. We don't have, all we have is a letter that we think he probably wrote, and that's about it. So we know he was there. We know he was in the street somewhere. You can imagine him, going through the alleys and the back streets of Whitechapel looking for his next victim, but we don't know.
And we know that it was the same person that committed these horrific crimes because of his signatures on those bodies, that they were positioned in the same way, that they were, hunted within the same radius of each other. So you know that it's one person that did all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then you're just left sort of in the air. And I think it is notable that when Albert Backer disappears, the murderer seems to have disappeared as well. But there were a lot of other suspects that people have named that disappeared sort of off the map, and maybe you don't attribute some of the murders to Jack the Ripper. And I'm really interested to hear you guys' theories in the comment section below, because this is one case that we can absolutely talk about. So what do you know about Jack the Ripper? What is your theory on it? Who do you think did it? What is a book that you have read about Jack the Ripper? I want to thank Jen for coming on the show today, and I want to thank Mick for helping us with our research, because oh man, this was a lot. So let's talk about it in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more episodes of Murder with Friends, and we will see you next week.